welcome everyone to CIMM Sessions, our little bite-sized servings of theology, culture, and community of Christ identity, message, mission, and beliefs, as well as practices. I'm Zach Harmon-Mclaughlin, the Dean of the Community of Christ Seminary at Graceland University. And tonight we're starting a two-part series this week and next week on crossing generational cultures, a boomer and a millennial walk into a church. Ba-doom-tsh. You'll have to come next week as well to get the punchline. So, that's just the headline. Tonight, our presenter is David Lloyd, who also happens to be part of the Seminary team and our director of the Center for Innovation in Ministry and Mission, which is what we lovingly call CIMM. And he will be presenting the first part of this series, and then next week we'll switch places. He'll introduce us and facilitate the question and answer, and I'll share. So with that, let's share together in tonight's presentation. I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks, Zach. I really appreciate it. Now, as you can tell, we have a boomer and a millennial who are leading these next 2 weeks. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about what makes the difference in the way that we communicate with each other, get along with each other, go to church together, and everything along that line. So I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. We're starting talking about crossing generational cultures and what that means and how it's important in the life of the church. I get so tired of hearing, why don't the kids come to church anymore? It's something that we say in every one of our congregations, and it has rationale behind it that we want to maintain and understand the context of why this is happening and what we can do to cross-generational cultures. I'd like to start out first with a scripture from Doctrine and Covenants 161 and share together as kind of a Lectio Divina in regard to what we're trying to accomplish in these two classes over the next 2 weeks. 161:3a says, "Do not be fearful of one another. Respect each life journey, even in its brokenness and uncertainty, for each person has walked alone at times. Be ready to listen and slow to criticize, lest judgments and unrighteousness be unredemptive. Be mindful of the changing of life seasons, of the passages from the springtime of childhood and youth to the wintry years of life. Embrace the blessings of your many differences. Be tender and caring, and be reminded that once again the gifts of all are necessary in order that divine purposes may be accomplished." So I'd like to put first things first in regard to this experience together. So I want to first acknowledge that we have a lot of difficult work ahead. As we approach these subjects, we are in danger of doing some things that I want to warn us about firsthand. And that difficult work ahead includes, first of all, oversimplification. The complexity of what we're going to talk about the next few weeks is beyond just this little study we can do in 2 weeks. And so in a lot of ways, we're going to oversimplify things. And I just want to warn us before that so that as we go into it, we can understand a little bit more of what we're dealing with and the complexity of it all. Also, prejudice. A lot of times when we talk about generational groups, we have the difficulty of using the information that we get to oppress or gain control over other groups. In other words, once we learn things about the other groups, we use that against them. It's a common thing we do as a culture, and I just want to beforehand say that it's not okay for us to do this, to prejudge groups of people based on these lists that we make about them. And as we talk about what makes them unique, there are many other things that make people unique. So let's be aware of that as we start to go into this. And also stereotyping. One size does not fit all. And we can very easily say, well, all the millennials are like this, or all the boomers are like this. One size doesn't fit everybody. And we want to make sure that as we get into this discussion, that we identify when we are making that stereotypical relationship to a group. It's fun sometimes in jest, but it also can be hurtful to people. So as we begin our process of looking at this, I want to talk about the difficulty of what we're doing and the fundamentals of reaching across the postmodern age. we're going to be talking a lot about modernity and postmodernity. And these are larger than generational groups. Each age holds a number of generational groups in it. And we have crossed over from one age to another in the lifetime of a lot of us who are watching this today. We have moved from the age of modernity, and we'll talk about what that means, and moved into a different time where things are drastically different. There has been a cultural revolution, so to speak, that's taken place in the Western culture. And as we talk about these generational groups, you'll begin to be able to see that, yes, these ages have made us look at the world in a different way. So, first of all, I want to talk about that when we're talking about these generational groups and these age groups, we're talking about it from a mostly Western point of view. So I say that just because there are a number of groups and cultural groups who experience this differently. The modernist point of view, and I'm going to say just to start out, and we'll get into this a little bit more in depth, those people who were born before the mid-1960s have still a primarily modernist point of view. And here are some of the characteristics you can tell are modernist in nature. That knowledge is inherently good is a modernist point of view. Postmodernists would have a different thing to say about that. That meta-narratives are crucial. And what I mean by meta-narrative is any overarching structure that you put around an institution to explain it or to understand it is usually called a meta-narrative. And it is how we frame, a good way to look at it is in regard to the church. We can say the church is blank. And as many of us who can rally around that meta-narrative makes a sense of community. But for postmoderns, the meta-narrative is the problem. And so we're going to talk about how that meta-narrative works and doesn't work within the generations. Another modernist point of view is that personal freedom is the human goal. We'll talk about that a little bit more too. That God rewards faithful discipleship. You know, God does good to those who do good. And that is a modernist point of view. I think most of us have probably broken from that a little bit to recognize that it rains on both the just and the unjust, as Jesus says. But it is a pretty well-held belief from modernists that if you work hard and you do good, that you will be rewarded, both in this life and the next. And that is a modernist point of view, pretty much thrown away in postmodernity. And also that modern contemporary history is the span of historic events from 1851 to approximately 1945, according to some sociologists, during the industrial period. In other words, this is the modern contemporary history. So modernity in contemporary history usually takes place from this event. So you can see it's gone a long way to change as far as an era in Western civilization. So a quick take on what the fundamentals of modernity is. And that is mostly that we're moving from knowledge into interpretation. This is overly simplistic, but I wanted to boil it down. And that postmoderns defy meta-narratives. Get a hold of those two things and you get the great cultural divide that we have mostly gone through. Here's a danger point for all of us. I want us to recognize that I am going to approach the generational understanding from a modernist point of view. I can't help it. It's part of my background. Now, I will talk about where I come from on the generational approach, but I understand both modernity and postmodernity because I've got a foot in each one. It doesn't mean that I'm good in one and bad in another. It means I just understand where they're coming from. So as I am revealing these things that have been brought to us by sociologists which again is a modernist place to go, that saying that knowledge is good, and these people who have made these lists have known what they're doing. I want to again remind us of the danger that as we talk about these generational groups and you see yourself there, you might not see yourself in the generational group I talk about. And so we'll mention a little bit more about that as we go on. So, the Pew Research Center and other outlets have established this as a generally recognized current generational groups. I'm just going to list them all out here. The silent generation, born between 1928 and 1945, again, these are dates that sociologists have brought about that I find, depending on what author you're listening to, they differ greatly. And it's probably a good idea to take all these dates with a grain of salt, because it is a theory, and there are events that take place in American history and Canadian history that they go from to say that these are defining ages of these people. I would say there's a sliding scale on these dates, so just go with me on that. The silent generation, born between 1928 and 1945, generally in their 70s and 80s. The baby boomers, born between 46 and 64, in their late 60s and 70s. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980, in their late 40s and 50s. I want you to notice how these dates are changing. They're not stuck in like 20-year increments. It's interesting, and there are reasons for that. The millennials, also known as Generation Y, born between 1981 and 1996, they're in their 30s and 40s. Generation Z, born between 1997 and 2012, they're in their late teens and early 20s. We have Generation Alpha, born from 2013 to 2024. They're infants and people in their mid-teens. And the Beta, or Gen Beta, is the succeeding generation after Gen Alpha. Their name was coined by demographer, and the birth years for this cohort are expected to be 2025 to 2039. They're not even around right now. So they're still, people love to sell books. So that's the reason why we have that group. So now I'm going to give this to you on another plane. And instead of looking at your birth date, I would like you to think about your life during what I call the decade of influence. And that's between 15 and 25. And think about all the things that took place in your life between that small decade. And what built the framework of who you are. As you can probably tell, a lot of the main paradigms of your life were created during this particular time, such as music and arts. I always love to teach this class and go through each generation and talk about music. What was the music of your generation between 15 and 25? And by golly, I would bet most of you still enjoy, out of all the music styles that you might listen to, that music that took place during that decade. And we're recognizing that when people get older, they enjoy watching television shows based on that time period when they were in that framework. There is a sense of going back to that place often, and we, as we grow older, continue to go back to that decade as a foundation of what we believe and who we are. We also are affected in our politics around that age. Our education is usually becoming complete within that age. Our sexual identification and understanding of who we are as sexual beings takes place during this decade. It might change and vary during the time, but for the most part, you know pretty much where you are by that decade. We also recognize that our career moves in a direction that might change paths as we go, but the foundation of that career is usually set during this 10-year period. Now, a lot of us can jump from that, but that foundation still remains. In your faith engagement, who you are faithfully, between the age of 15 and 25. This is moving, actually interesting. This is moving later into life, usually around the time that you're having children. There's a lot of a return to faith experiences from your decade of influence. So if we put that on a timeline, this is what it looks like. You got the silent generation, the boomer generation, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and alphas. And the decade I have below it is kind of an area between two gray parts of where your decade of influence would be. So that time between 15 and 25 years of age puts you in kind of these different categories of generational groups. Now, then there comes, so you can see it here, the difference between the modern era and the postmodern era. And you can see that line goes through the last little bit of the boomers. So the boomers are at the point of, and you can think of it, they are going through a time of cultural crisis during the 60s. And I can spend a whole hour talking about how that works, because the changes that take place in American and Canadian culture during the 60s are phenomenal. And they move us in this direction. But this kind of gives you an overview of how those generations are set up. Now, you'll note that even though we call these generational groups, we don't have usually more than 4 generations of people living at the same time. And we have 6 groups here. So again, these are not really generational groups, are they? They're kind of a mishmash, and people are going in between these. And I find myself, I'm not going to tell you what year I was born in, but I was influenced in the very early part of my life by the 1960s, but I was more influenced by the 70s. And then I became a youth minister and got immersed in the culture of the 80s. And because of that, I find that I identify more in the Gen X culture than I do in the boomer culture. And many of you will find as we go through these generations that you are the same. Again, let's talk about where the wars are waged in the church between these two eras. If you're looking at leadership, you'll see that most of the people in the modern era look at leadership from a CEO or manager point of view. In postmodern, you look at mostly a spiritual guide or fellow journeyer as a leader. It is the difference between Star Trek in the modern era of being Captain Kirk alone in his seat on the Starship Enterprise. And in the postmodern era, you've got 3 people in the captain's seat and a group of people who are used for their gifts surrounding that leadership. It's quite a different look. It's a reason why we went from pastors to co-pastors in most congregations. It's the difference between us looking at priesthood having authority and priesthood having relationships. And this goes further as we talk about the difference from modernity and concentrated power and diffuse power in leadership in postmodernity, or going from goals-driven in the modern era into relationship-driven in the postmodern era. Going from valuing uniformity, everybody believing the same thing and going along together, which has been a little bit different in our faith movement, but you can still see it, and going into a time where we value diversity more. And you can see how that really has changed even in the life of the church. And then going from leading by talking to leading by listening. So this is where a lot of our problems in our congregation tend to occur, is because when you have a modern era leader leading the congregation, it disengages the postmodern people from how that leadership is taking place and what the message is and how it's presented. And we can go into hours in just looking at this one area between the 2 eras. Okay, I'm going to talk about each one of I'm going to focus for a little bit on the modernist era, since that's what I'm supposed to be talking about today. But I'll give you a little information on the postmodern generations too. The first one being the silent generation. Now, these are people who have whose parents have just gone through the Depression, and yet in their work lifetime, they go into the early part of the computer age. Can you imagine the amount of change that goes from point A to point B? They also came into their generation of influence right after the Second World War, when a lot of things were culturally changing. We were moving to the suburbs. Industry was picking back up again. Rosie the Riveter was an iconic character for how women could be part of the workplace. Well, the men come back from war and the women go back home, but the women tell their daughters. And because of that, the next generation changes. We change information sources. And this is a really, really critical one. We go from the radio, where we hear people talking about the news, and we get our news from newspapers. Dad and mom are sitting, at breakfast reading the newspaper, and we get it from a single source. But then, as time moves on, we go into television, and you get two networks, and then a third network comes in, and then they introduce UHF. Anyone remember UHF? And now you have 6 or 7 different television channels that you can watch. And then this guy comes to your house, and they say, I got this great deal for you. I can bring this cable into your house, and you'll get 20 channels. And you laugh them off their sidewalk because you're not going to pay $10 to get 20 channels. And then the next time they come, they have 50 channels, and they say, come on in. And then we're starting to see that programming goes from the broad market of consumers, and it gets narrower and narrower. And now we go to an age where it's not just small subgroups. We're being programmed our news through algorithms that are designed specifically for us. And there's this thing called the echo chamber that I'm sure a number of you have heard, where we stay long enough in that place where media is fed to us individually. All we hear is our own voice, and we don't hear outside of that. So again, this is a huge change that takes place in their lifetime. They were the swing generation. When I use music and talk to people about, how did they express themselves musically, I think of Glenn Miller and Perry Como and Frank Sinatra and up until Elvis Presley of how this generation changed in music. Institutional loyalty is a really important part of their paradigm. That you went out of college or out of high school and you worked for the Ford factory, and you would work for the Ford factory for the rest of your life. And you bought Ford products, and you had Westinghouse in your home, and you wouldn't buy anything else because that was the right brand to buy. And so there was this meta narrative over industry, and we would believe that and follow that, even if we were confronted with something that was better. No, I will stay with this because of my institutional loyalty. That also worked with churches. We believed in institutional loyalty because we had been programmed to do so, even if it had some dissonance into what we really believed. The silent generation also had this pulled together ideology. Now, I say that even though there were a number of people who did not see a full picture of what their culture was, but they did believe the idea of all of us should pull together. And then it went to what we call now, and I say this from another generational viewpoint, a traditional theology. Traditional theology in the United States around that time would be coming out of the experience of there being both professional ministers and the traveling minister idea, and the idea of Western culture being God ordained, and so we can spend too much time talking about that. Let's go on to the next generation, the boomers, and the boomers went from the industrial age into the middle class ideal. People were moving out of the agrarian church and into suburban areas and making a home, having two cars because the couples were working two jobs, and that brought up the income of the middle class. We didn't talk too much about war, but Vietnam was a huge change for the American public in how we viewed war. In World War II, it was heroic. There was a purpose. We knew who the enemy was. We went in there, did our job, and came out victorious. Vietnam was a totally different story. And we saw it every day in our living rooms on the 5 o'clock news. And it was bloody and it was awful, and there were people protesting it. Total different framework in how this generation looked at war. The changing role of women, the ERA began in that time. Feminism becomes an ideal as it's being moved forward. The change in race relationships, especially during the 60s civil rights movement. The role of TV increases. They become the rock generation, different music styles. Things were a changing in the 1960s. It turns into from a pulled together mentality to a me generation. That has both positive and negative attributes to it. If you ever hear an insurance ad on TV and they say, get all the insurance that you deserve, guess who they're marketing to? It's to the boomers, because they are part of that idea of, I deserve more insurance. I don't know how I deserve more, but I feel that way. The loss of authority is a part of this group. And I talk about the loss of authority, meaning we don't really like authority. This is a real move into the postmodern ideal too. It changes. And a rise in Pentecostal theology takes place, especially in the 1960s. Now, I'm just going to go through the post-modernity generations really quickly. I think Zach will be able to share a little bit more. Going from the affluent to the disaffected, as I said there, going from affluent to, and part of the name, you can see I have here the Busters. Actually, this is Gen X. And I still have a problem with the name Gen X because it was coined by Newsweek, and it was a negative connotation for this generation. It basically is, I don't care. Big X for me on this. And I don't think it really adequately explained this generation, but I'm going to use Busters as another word to call this group, but Gen X is what it's mostly known as. The rise of the internet takes place during this time. There's a pinch between two generations that are very change oriented. They become their music is rap, hip hop, and grunge. They are the we generation, which I really like. It's not the me generation, but the we generation, and we see that influencing a lot of what's happening at that time. There is a great need for authenticity by this group. One of the mantras is be authentic. And it moves into a more relational theology. And then next, we go to the millennials. They are a major change generation. They are affected by September 11th drastically. Two things, September 11th and Columbine. There was a trajectory for the millennials that I remember following when I was doing this work years ago. And it trajected the millennials to go this direction. And then these two events take place around the time of their decade of influence, and it changes them significantly. Some people have said that they were going to go into a rational revenge ideology, and that's a misnomer. They never went that direction, thank goodness. In other words, revenge for all the evil that has been done to our generation and our time. But it did create a very fearful relationship to being on the watch. Terrible things have happened, and they witnessed it in formative years. And as a result of that, their response to gun violence is heightened, and all violence is is part of the rationale of how they define their generation. Perceived obsolescence, and we get this after the year 2000. There is a sociological clock in all of our heads that tell us when we should expect a change in something. And the best way to look at it is a cell phone. And for those in the silent generation, that change will be like, the phone's dead, I got to get a new one. And then the boomers would be, my the payment on the phone is over, I should get a new one. And then the Gen Xers are, oh, the new iPhones come out, and the millennials are, oh, well, how soon can I get this upgrade? And the expected amount of change increases as these generations go by, and the perceived obsolescence of things place us in a place of both positive and negative. When you're able to move quickly with technology, you can pass up a lot of people and be more pertinent and relevant. And this also goes with how expectations are of when things would change. And if we're not meeting the expectation of, well, this has been tried, we need to change, then we start to see with the millennials a need for more change in their life in order for things to stay relevant. Fascinating how these things work and how they're programmed into us as we're growing up. Cocooning, basically talk about that echo chamber that we're in. Truman always, when he walked around Independence here, would say that the detriment of all humanity was air conditioners because it caused people to get off their porch and go into the house, and he wouldn't see them when he was walking by on his daily walk. That kind of cocooning has increased as time has gone on, and it's something that we recognize as taking place within the millennial generation. They are a more mosaic generation, little pieces of things, put it together in a beautiful picture to make a framework of how they see the world. The need for relationships is high, the interactive mind that they have, and a more universal theology begins to come in this group. Then we have Gen Z, pre-wired, never known a world where the internet did not exist, more sexually aware and fluid, the most multiracial of any generation before it, as the white population decreases actually, more justice-oriented, the recognition of living in a safe world. They were the generation growing up where in elementary school, they were taught how to duck and cover, not for an atom bomb, but for an intruder. And the emerging theology is we're still recognizing what that emerging theology is, if any, for that generation. And I'm going to leave Alpha because it hasn't been long enough for us to actually know what Gen Alpha is. So I'm going to leave that for the cultural anthropologists. Now, there's another way of looking at this too. If we look at a timeline, there's not only generations that we're a part of, but there is also age experiences that most human beings go through. And again, this is an overgeneralization, but this might also help you as we talk to each other across generations to know what's going on within each of us as we approach different ages. So this is a life scale here from birth to death. And the first group is the big, beautiful world group, and that's from 0 to around 18. If you live with teenagers, it could be as low as 10. The big, beautiful world concept is basically my parents are taking care of most of my needs, and life is pretty good. I might hate my math in third hour, but for the most part, it's a big, beautiful world out there. And I'm just growing into it to understand who I am and what life is about. And the next thing that happens is that decade of influence we talk about, the place where most of our life decisions are made, or at least the foundation upon which they are made. That 15 to 25 year period where we are making some choices as to who we are. The next thing that comes down, the sifting and claiming. The idea that we've got a big sifter in our hand, and we're sifting through all the things that are happening in our life and letting some of it spill over to see what is left in that sifter. And then claiming that as who we are. It's a point in our life where we are starting to feel a little bit more comfortable in our vocation. We are in a place of parenthood or middle adult experience where we are understanding what the framework of our family and household life is. And we claim it as part of our identity. A very interesting period of time. Wish we had time to talk about that more. Then from 40 to about 58 or so, we have the reinvention and solidification era, where a lot of times we have gone through 40 years of life and say, I don't know if that's me anymore. I need to consider if I need to change who I am or re-identify who I am and solidify what that means to me. Sometimes it can be a change in job. So a lot of marriages end around the time that children leave the home. And many things are happening after we have just claimed what we think is us, this time where we become more naturally who we are, and we decide that these are the things I want to solidify in my life as understanding who I am. Then we come to this wonderful time, somewhere between 58, 60, and 70, usually around the time before we retire, where we are in the expertise era, where we have done all the sifting and all this reinvention and all this solidification, and we now feel for maybe the first time that we know what we're talking about. We might not, but we feel that way. And it's a time where people look to you as still being engaged with the culture and still being involved in some kind of occupation or hobby even. And you are at this point usually an expert at something. And then we come to the releasing era, where we decide after we have finished our work, after we have gone through all the life experiences, these are the final things that we hold on to as we release other things. And I want you to look and see where you are on your life cycle too, because how we talk to each other across these different areas is really important. Now, you will notice that for a lot of silent generation and boomers, the people who are in the modernist part of our eras, that we're in the fall, if not the winter, of our lives, and in some things we know what we're talking about. But just because you're in an expertise era doesn't mean you know what's going on in the upcoming generations as they're beginning to still do some of the sifting. And some of the sifting is some of the things that you might be an expert on. And so that can be disconcerting sometimes. So as we look at charts like this, we recognize that even as we look at our own lives, that there are some real difficult crossovers that we have to make as we communicate with people in different life eras. So as people age, we think of age being a filter and so much being thrown at us that we have decided what we allow to fall through and what is really valued. So as you're talking to people in the modernist age, think of what they have filtered. Think about in our own church how they went from being people who believed that we were the one true living church on the earth and all the others were wrong, into a time where we have not only released ourselves of that, but they have grown through that to make sense of where they are in the life of the church today. Most of the people who are in the modernist era have released a lot of what the modernist era told them. In fact, they are crumbling some of their own meta narratives and trying to find desperately another one to replace it, and are finding that there's not many answers. Do you remember the period of time, and it still might be in your area, where the biggest question to the church was, I just want to know what we believe? And the answer from headquarters came back pretty silent. And now we've got the mission initiatives and the enduring principles that kind of help us a little bit along that way, but they're not a list of things that we must believe. They're ideas. And so we've kind of moved into that era of redefining what it means to say what we believe. And we learn from our past pain. In our younger years, we make mistakes. And as we age, we shield ourselves from the things that caused us pain, and we develop these calluses. And so it becomes a little bit harder to talk about painful things, but we can get there as long as it doesn't pinch that nerve. And so sometimes for those in younger generations, it's hard to know what those landmines are, and vice versa. And so when we talk to each other, we need to be mindful, as the scripture said that we read earlier, be tender and caring for each other, to recognize where those pinch points might be. You recognize that, like in the silent generation, they just came out of the experience of going through their parents going through the depression, and because of that, they became very frugal with money, and so we want to understand that the reason why they might be a little frugal with money is because they know the value of losing it. And yet they're still one of the main givers of the church today. And so all these things that we learned from past pain, the boomers in war, the millennials in firearms, are some of those pinch points. And recognize also that as we age, we bend. There's the bend of conserving. And I don't want to say the bend of being conservative. I want to say the bend of conserving. As we age, we choose what we want to conserve and protect and disseminate, rather than giving new consideration to new ideals. Now, that doesn't mean we don't. And I'm going to give a shout out to my parents-in-law, who are in their late 80s and early 90s, and have gone through all the changes in the church and are still pretty, in fact, they're on tonight, they're still staying connected with theology and the changes going on in theology. May we all be open to be able to continue to make those changes as we recognize the bend of conserving in our life. I am about at the end. I wanted to end with this. There is also good news for you folks who are in the older generation. There is what I call the GPAWS and Mimi effect. And that is, if you grew up with 3 children, brothers and sisters, at least 3, you know the value of what you call triangulation. And that is, if one person has an idea, as long as he can get one other person with them, then they can beat up on this person. Okay? And what we're seeing is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Is there is now that older people are living longer, are living more healthily in their older age, there is more of a connection than there has been in many generations past between grandparents and their grandchildren, because they can beat up on their parents. Okay, they're in that generation between them, and but it's a wonderful opportunity for older people to connect with younger people in totally being out of different eras and generations, but being able to connect with each other because of some commonality threads. And I don't have time to get into all of them, but I lift that up as a positive thing. There is a place for older people with younger people, as well as with their own children, as we seek to understand each other from the different generations. And as we go into the future together, I would encourage us to learn a little bit more about another generation, to spend some time in being connected to their popular culture, what music they're listening to. I downloaded the Taylor Swift album last week. And the reason is it's because I know my granddaughter's listening to it and I have something to talk to her about. So as we go through the time and we enjoy listening and engaging in our own decade of influence experience, to take the time and make a connection with somebody outside of your generational group and listen to hear what their values are and what their concerns are as we move into the future. And I think that is all. So we have time for the question and answer time, and I'll turn it over to you, Zach.
Yeah, thanks, David. Man, I just want to jump into next week and start sharing because there's so many things to explore about this.
Well, hide your cards a little bit.
It's gonna be hard. It's gonna be hard for you. We already had one question in the chat. I'll ask it in just a second, but for everybody else, feel free if you have an additional question, feel free to drop it in the chat. We will be posting this recording edited up to get rid of boxes on our YouTube page as well, so you'll be able to find this conversation there. Before I ask the question that was dropped in the chat, a real quick question for you, David. And this is part of the difference between modernity and postmodernity, which is also a very functional difference of generational identity, which is the function and value of time. You shared several linear progressions of
very modernist of me
as we age.
Yep.
And a big gap between these ways of seeing the world are linear ways of thinking versus complex nonlinear ways of thinking. And that is largely due to some of what you talked about between the difference of modernity and postmodernity, a value of authority, a total lack of value for authority. What impact do you think that understanding of time and the value of time impacts how these generations experience perspective, timeline, process, value, all of those kinds of things?
Well, yeah, and it's a perspective that you can't fully understand. A younger generation can't understand it because they haven't experienced it, and the older generation can't understand because they have not experienced it from that point of view. And so we're guessing all the time. It's a wonder we can communicate at all, honestly. And a lot of times people talk about, well, we can talk about cultural differences between people of different skin color, or people of who are male or female or binary or whatever their orientation is. And we see those, or nationalities. We see those so easily, but we think that every generation is homogeneous with all the others, that we all came from the same place. Why don't we believe the same thing? And it's because of that experience. Our roads are different, that we've gotten to the same place. And what it takes is, and I said, if you're ever offering ministry to a specific age group and you recognize that's who you're supposed to be communicating to, it's like you're going to another country where they don't speak English. And how are you ever going to accomplish transferring the message that you have? Well, you've got to learn the language. You've got to learn their customs. You know, if I put my hand out and I shake their hand, is that seen as a good thing or an insult? You know, all the things that are part of that culture that have created all these paradigms of how people see the world. And that paradigm shift of change being expected is going so fast right now that it's really hard for people to relate to each other. And the only way I think it can happen, the hardest place for it to happen is from somebody from the preaching pulpit disseminating to a whole group and expecting that message is going to cover everybody. But when we individually sit down with somebody, we find that either we don't have anything to talk about, or we come prepared with something that connects with that group that we feel like we can have a conversation about. So it takes some intentionality and recognition that and asking yourself the question, if I ask a question and I get a totally different response than what I'm expecting, then I don't try to ram down my idea down their throat, but I want to stop and say, well, can you tell me more about that? Where are you coming from in that perspective? And it's a lot harder work.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about that more next week because what you're really talking about is the value of curiosity.
Yeah.
Because we say the same word, but it doesn't mean the same thing.
Yeah.
Because the lenses and filters in which we're making meaning out of that come from very different spaces. And then we get confounded because we're like, but we're the same. We're both community of Christ. We both live in the same
Right.
city, and we do share similarities or sameness to a point. But that sameness drops out at a certain point. So we'll
Yeah.
go into that
Absolutely.
next week.
Absolutely.
There was an absolutely excellent question about the impact of location on some.
Hmm.
So I think in one of your earlier slides, you specifically called out Western culture, Western
Yeah.
identity.
Yeah.
But even within that, we have subcultures and layers of
Absolutely.
the subculture within culture. So how does your social location or physical location impact some of this?
If you've ever been asked to do ministry outside of your jurisdiction, you'll know heck, if you go in independence from one congregation to another, you'll recognize there are differences. And I don't know why that catches us off guard, but yeah, I mean, I worked in Canada for 5 years. It was glorious, but a different culture and one that I had to release some of my Americanism in order to relate. So yeah, location has a lot of cultural impact.
Yeah. Um, Not seeing any additional questions yet in the chat, but I have another one. And I can ask questions all night, David, so you're going to have to tell us when we have to go home.
No,
And
we get 5 minutes.
uh, as you were kind of talking about the phases of our life, and I'm interested in this particularly from a theological seminary point of view, right? Which is when and how does deconstruction happen?
Yeah,
Because like what we all know is we're not the same, right?
right.
I'm not the same person I was a week ago, let alone a decade ago, let alone 20 years ago. Um, and there are kind of these moments of deconstruction, reshaping, maybe letting go of some of that decade of influence or reinterpreting that decade of influence. So
Yeah,
I was interested in that.
deconstruction is always on a sliding scale, right? We can deconstruct our theology from the one true church into God loves all theology, but it goes back to another even more foundational thing, and that is that God is love. And that helps us to make that move and that deconstruction to a different mindset or a different theological viewpoint. We are always going through deconstruction. The times we note it are when it's most traumatic, when it means that I also have to change other aspects of my lifestyle. It's not just I believe a verse out of John more than I believe a verse out of Luke. It's about I'm reading the Doctrine and Covenants now, and that puts me in a different community. So I think deconstruction happens at each one of those age groups, the eras of life. We make foundations from our childhood to around 25. We might wipe that house off, but that foundation still stays there. There are always parts of that foundation that we will not let go of, and they are the main motivators in our life. And it can be as simple as love, or compassion, or justice, a peace. Those things that are the most important basic elements that have made us who we are, unless we go through something so traumatic that we go into a negative area where it has been positive, and that's a could be a psychosis or a negative change in our life. But I think every stage of life that I've been through at this particular time has had a certain amount of deconstruction. I've worked in different jobs in the church, and every job I've changed has been a deconstruction. So the thing we have to recognize is that change is coming, and change is a part of God's work in our life. We used to think that God was, unchangeable, but God never said that we're not unchangeable.
Yeah.
Our understanding of God consistently changes as we mature.
Yeah. So that, how I see that and how we talk about that in some of the ways we teach it in seminary is, there's change can happen, but it can still be static change, which is it's predictable, we understand it, and it doesn't really require behavioral changes, right? It's just an external change, but I don't have to be any different. And that's what we kind of call static change. And then we have dynamic change, right, where it is less predictable and I do have to make adjustments to participate. So, but it's also impacting what you started off by saying, which is none of these groups are monoliths
Right.
because that change is dynamic. So even though there are patterns that may be systemic, they're not a monolith because of the difference in deconstruction that happens at various points based on trauma or location or all those things. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I noticed somebody at the very end brought up the Myers-Briggs personality of an individual. Let me just state that because I have taught the Myers-Briggs and been a person who was able to conduct the Myers-Briggs test, I can definitely say it is all a hoax. Honestly, even the people who wrote it said it was a hoax. It's a way of categorizing people. Here's a good explanation of going from, from one age into another, into the postmodern age. We love to categorize people. And the Myers-Briggs allowed us to do that. I could say I was an ENFP, and I know exactly what that means. And yet I know that sometimes I'm in the judgmental part rather than, sometimes I'm in the introvert extrovert part. We live in multiple places, and that's part of our wonderful dynamic of who we are as human beings. If we can allow ourselves to see both sides, then we have something of consequence to say and share with each other. And so I would say stay away from those things, just like what I've taught you today, that have over-categorized groups of people, because every time we do that, we sometimes limit the truth of God to be whatever box we place God in. And I say the same thing is true for people. Every time we put a person in a box, we do everything possible to escape that box into freedom. And the same thing we do with God. Every time we put God in the box, God usually escapes the box and surprises us. And so let that be a lesson for us as we go in the future.
Before we close out, just responding to Claudia's comment in the chat, I'll provide several resources next week. And what I'll also do is I'll get with David and have him share some of the resources that he used for tonight. And at the end of my presentation next week, I'll have a little bibliography we can drop in the chat.
I've got a few books.
Join us next week. That'll be on YouTube as well.
That's right.
We'll figure it out.
So make sure you come next week as Zach takes on the postmodern ideal and how that is reflected in the church. Why we're not clicking so well in the life, because let's be honest, most modernists are still in leadership positions within the church and the local congregations, and church looks a lot different as we go into the postmodern era.